Welcome to Marx 1313. It's a great privilege to be here with Étienne Balibar, Judith Revel, Guillaume Leblanc, so many of you here to return to Marx's text, and so many online as well. Cathy, Wallerstein et d'autres. Merci. So, bien. So this year, in Marx 1313, we will be returning to 13 formative texts of Marx. And we will be pairing them with interpretations, commentary, readings of those texts that in a way blew open Marx's work and pushed us into other directions of Marxisms. And we'll be doing it with 13 extraordinary philosophers. 13 texts, 13 commentaries, 13 philosophers. The idea is to actualize these texts, to find ways to use them for our present, to reread them in order to find paths forward now in these times of crisis. And the times couldn't be more urgent. These texts have been some of the most impactful texts in history of the 20th century, at least, 19th and 20th. They have had extraordinary resonance. They have brought about revolutions, change, new ideas in ways that are unparalleled, really, in intellectual history. And the reason we're returning is because there's so much more for us to do with this work and with these texts, especially in these times. And so, as you know, and as you know me, the idea here is really to actualize them and think of them in our present. So we're starting today with Marx 113, starting with the Thesis on Feuerbach, read through the commentary of Ernst Bloch with Étienne Balibar. And it's a privilege to start with Étienne Balibar. It's a privilege for us.
Start with EB.
EB. There are two EBs on the table today. So it's a privilege to start with Étienne Balibar's reading of Ernst Bloch's reading of Marx's Thesis on Feuerbach. It's a privilege to come back in a way to some of the grounds that Étienne Balibar has been working on, toiling, thinking about for decades now. And it's a real privilege to start with Étienne Balibar today, to have him join us through the course of these seminars, and also we'll be closing with him in May. We've got an incredible lineup for the year. Judith Revel is going to be starting our next Marx 213, when we'll be turning to the debate on the theft of woods and Foucault's writings about illégalisme. And that'll be next Tuesday, the 12th of October. But it's really a privilege to start with Étienne, who has shown us so many ways of entering into Marx's text and offered over the years some of the most generous, often heterodox, careful and penetrating reading of Marx's work since the 1960s, really, and the famous seminar that gave rise, of course, to Reading Capital. And of course in other texts as well, Philosophy of Marx and others. I think that I don't really want to say much more than to turn it over to Étienne. We've spoken about the format and the presentation, and we've come together on this idea of first kind of justifying the place of the theses as the point of entry into this year's series. Commenting on the reading today in relation to all of Marx's work and Western philosophy in the present, and also discussing Bloch's interpretation and the implications of his reading for a certain, again, for a certain unorthodox way of moving forward with Marx. All right, so I want to turn it over as quickly as possible to Étienne to help us dive into this year's readings of Marx 1313. Merci, Étienne.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you all. Thank you, Columbia. I understood that the format of this session is completely open. I mean, we have infinite time from what I So, nevertheless, perhaps you'll have to control me so that I can say at least part of what I have prepared. Some of you know my propension, my capacity to add additional considerations which make the discourse proliferate. But in any case, I will have said something when you stop me. I don't want to be too personal, too sentimental, but allow me one word about what being here today means for somebody who has been your colleague and your guest and your interlocutor for quite a bit of time. Like this year is the 1313 project has been running for
10 years.
10 years. So it's exactly 10 years.
Yeah.
Yes. And it began, some of you know, but not all of you know that. Hence, from what I understood, and that's interesting to mention, the return, the periodic, the continuous, the eternal return of this mystical number, 13. Where does that come from? Why 1313 and then 113, 213, etc., etc.? I'm doing 113, and then you'll have to decide if you want me to do 1313 at the end of this year. Perhaps you'll think it's enough, and
You're locked in.
Understand. So this came from the fact that 10 years ago or 11 years ago, Bernard Harcourt arrived at Columbia, a newly appointed professor of law and philosophy, and many other things. And among the projects that he immediately launched with the collaboration, of course, of other faculties there. At the time, I was visiting professor or something like that. But above all, and I have not only a vivid memory of that, but it's an immense admiration for the way you proceeded, the collaboration and active participation of several groups of students year after year, PhD students and others, all of them working on extremely concrete and urgent subjects which touched law, of course, politics, American politics, ethics, death penalty in America, and so on. And so your idea was, correct me if I'm wrong, we'll do a series of public discussions, presentations, and discussions of the 13 books that have been now completely published containing Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France. It happened, it's like that, that Foucault taught 13 courses or classes at the Collège de France, and they are today, of course, an absolute reference for all of us. And so hence the number 13, because there were 13 years in Foucault's teaching to discuss. A challenge, of course, in one session, one volume, and already you had this idea to try and organize confrontations between, I wouldn't say the legacy of the past, because Foucault at the time and even now is not yet completely past. He's a contemporary, at least for some of us. But this extraordinary philosophical heritage and some contemporary work being done, etc. So you asked me to participate in the first series. Forgive me for the anecdotes, but among other reasons, but that was very powerful, if I will remember, because the courses had not been published in chronological order. They had been published according to various imperatives. Beginning, if I well remember, with society must be defended. Why that? Because Foucault had forbidden any publication after his death. That never works. But some édition pirate had been made, and it had all begun with an édition pirate. I don't know what the English would be for that, but everybody understands. In Italian, of the series Society Must Be Defended, in which you find some of the most challenging reflections of Foucault about central issues of Marxism and Marxian theory, namely the idea deriving from a wrong quotation, but Foucault can be forgiven for that, of one letter in Marxist correspondence that traces back the idea of class struggle to the classical problematic of the race struggle, or the struggle of races among 18th century and 19th century historians. So at the end of the series arrived the a volume that it was a problem for an editor, because for all of Foucault's courses, there are, you have Foucault's personal notes, which are, from what I've never seen them, but from what I understand, quite precise and accurate and developed. But then, of course, you have the tape recordings that were made by the auditors at the Collège de France. You know, when Foucault spoke from a kind of platform like this one higher, he was surrounded by little apparatuses, recorders, tape recorders, and so you had all these recordings, and you could, of course, from there, it's a classical work of publication, establish, as we say in French, établir a standard text, using his notes to check and the recordings to get the complete, except for 1 year and one volume, which chronologically must have been the second year of his teaching, called Théorie et Institution Pénale, for which there existed no recordings. I'm very surprised of that, but don't discuss that. It's a fact. So you only had Foucault's notes, preparatory notes, which again are very clear and articulate with the key sentences he wants to insist on, and the quotations. No references, but the quotations, etc., etc. So they decided this could not remain missing, of course, in the series of the courses. So Bernard, who was in charge of this particular volume, decided, with the help of others, decided to publish Foucault's notes, and that remains readable. I don't know if any of you have tried to. And then when the volume was practically already in print, I mean, completely finished, we were together at Columbia, so an idea crosses his mind, you know. And he says to me, look, I have found in the text several allusions to Althusser, you know, this dubious guy. And I suspect that there are more than what I have traced, because there are explicit references, but there must be others which are less explicit. Would you kindly look at the manuscript? I mean, at the proofs. There were proofs already, huh? And tell me if you notice something remarkable or interesting that ought to be indicated in this respect. I said, okay, I'll do that gladly. I was teaching my class. How much time do I have? He said 2 days, 3 days, because this goes to print. But for a number of reasons that you easily imagine, I couldn't even wait for the 3 days. The night after that, I eagerly started. I didn't sleep. I read the whole volume, and I came back to Bernard, and allusions to Althusser. You bet. It's full of allusions to Althusser. It's obsessed with a kind of this text of kind of settlement of accounts or confrontation with Althusser's at the time famous theory of the ideological state apparatuses. And then I wrote a quick letter to him, and he trapped me. He put it in the volume as an afterword, so I could never withdraw it. I said anything that crossed my mind, and that, etc., etc. And I participated in the first series. And then after that, perhaps I skipped to Europe, but I'm not sure. You ask me every year, what a friend this is. But it's a dangerous honor, of course, and this year more dangerous than any other. And of course, it brings my mind, that's why I said I would be a little sentimental, to the fact that I will no longer travel to Columbia, to the campus, teach classes there, to the city of New York. Each thing must finish. But today it's almost as if I was back again there. Thank you so much, Bernard, for your continuous. Okay, that was much too long. Let's. So I thought of 5 or different points, but they are of very unequal length and importance. The first 2, of course, have to do with my suggestion, my choice, my suggestion that we could begin with a reading or a fresh reading of the the famous Thesis on Feuerbach, allegedly written by Marx in 1845. We come back to that. This is well known in a sense. But so I don't think I betray any secret or any shameful aspect of your work. That was not Bernard's initial plan. In a moment, if I have time for that, I'll come to the fact that organizing the corpus of Marx's writings and works and texts is a problem per se, of course. So when you decide that you will again embark on reading Marx and thinking with Marx and thinking about Marx, which is our project here, you face many different possibilities. But Bernard's initial project was simple and rational. He said, We'll select 13 texts. It's already, of course, a challenge in a sense. Some of Marx's writings are brief. They are like cannon shots, and others are complex, systematic, encyclopedic, and among them, of course, in the corpus that today is used and considered a necessary reference, some are unfinished. So to select 13 readings is already a problem. But then the idea that you should read them and discuss them in chronological order is quite natural, simple. And so the first of the texts that Bernard, when we spoke about the project, I mean, he spoke with others, of course, but I was one of them, featured at the beginning was the article or the group of articles about which Judith Revel is going to speak next time. And that will be an enjoyment for you and for her. The group of articles known as the Theft of Woods, articles written by Marx as a young journalist and political essayist in 1842, is that right? 1842. Okay, I leave it to her. It's not my. You could think of starting even before that. If you think that Marx, above all, is a philosopher, or Marx, you are interested in particular on the fact that in the fact that Marx was trained as a philosopher and had, you could begin with his doctorate, I mean, philosophy doctorate, the thesis on Democritus and Epicurus, which more recently, from different angles, has been okay. But you have to make a choice. And then we discussed about that, and he asked me, "Would you agree that it's a good thing to begin with that and continue with 1843 or 44 manuscripts and so on and so on?" And I said, if you ask me to do the first session for reasons which are your reasons and personal, as we said, I will not choose that. I'm immensely happy to leave it to Judith, who knows better than me what to say about it. But the reason why I make a different choice is of course a risky and dangerous one. I want to choose the thesis on Feuerbach because at some point, and I will say more about this in a minute, this text, when it was discovered, digged out from the Nachlass, as they say in German, that is the unpublished collection of manuscripts, soon became considered a kind of secret foundation of whatever Marx would have done, thought, and written later. So if you ask for a text, there are perhaps several other candidates for text in the Marxian legacy that can be considered foundational for his thoughts, a whole Marxist tradition will point at the thesis on Feuerbach. But the thesis of Feuerbach is a cryptic text, as you will see, or as you know, as you have seen already. It's an incredibly enigmatic text, although, of course, erudite readers, I'm not completely one of them, but I've read many of them, are able to explain almost each and every of the words, each and every of the sentences. by connecting them or associating them with the intellectual and particularly philosophical background that forms, I would say, its system of references. Did you put Althusser's plan here? Can I put it here? I come to that in a minute. So, but this doesn't prevent the text from being very enigmatic. Even the sentence, and that draws already our attention to a remarkable, I wouldn't say literary, but a characteristic of this text, which has to do with its mode of writing. Very simple sentences are supposed to be simple, whose interpretation, the word being precisely there in the text, seems to be unambiguous. And above all, of course, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers until now have interpretiert in German, which is not a normal German word. It's a little pejorative, perhaps. The world, we'll come to that, in different manners. And then there is a little divergence because the theses, I'll come to that in a minute, were published later, digged out, as I said, by Engels in 1888, and he made some corrections, which he thought were only necessary to clarify the syntax. So he introduced here the little German word aber, but, so, or however, that is so, as opposed to that attitude of the philosophers until now, to interpret the word, es kommt drauf an, sie zu verändern. The point is, it's a question to verändern, transform, usual translation, transform or change it. And the classical reading is that this thesis, I'll return if I have time to the ambiguity of the very notion of thesis, but is not a statement that describes Sachverhalt, as Wittgenstein would say, a state of affairs. It doesn't say, here is what the philosophers do, here is what the revolutionaries do. The philosophers interpret, understand, theorize, speculate, discuss meanings and consequent and ideas. On the other hand, aber, on the other side, the revolutionaries are not interested in that. They transform the world, a code formula for they do the revolution. Okay, but the sentence is not written in that mode, or it's not perceived most of the time. It's perceived as an injunction, It doesn't even say, if you want to be a revolutionary and not just a philosopher, start transforming the world, whatever that may mean. Of course, erect barricades in the streets, vote for the new Popular Front. No, that it's not enough, but etc., etc. But it sounds like an injunction, and in that sense, it seems to be simple. One of the great merits, I believe, is not the only one, but one of the great merits of Bloch's reading is to very clearly show that it's not as simple as that, and that that the however must be forgotten, and the meaning of this thesis is also in many respects enigmatic. But where do I want to arrive with that? Not just to the idea, you might begin to be horrified or a little bit afraid of what is going to come. In a sense, that's what I want to say. The real work with Marx's ideas will begin next week or next time. And I'm going to try and make things complicated, if possible, not confused, but nevertheless, and yes, ambivalent or ambiguous. What in fact I want to try and suggest, not demonstrate, but suggest with the help of the text, of course, using the text, is the fact that for reasons which have to do with the moment, with the kind of event that the publication of this thesis has been, the trace or the traces it has left, and the prerequisites, as I said earlier, the background, if you like, to which it takes us back. Today, at least, the theses on Feuerbach are or can be used not as an instrument or a text, if you like, that is foundational, that makes it possible to organize the system of Marxist philosophical and political and ideas, but in fact let me use my master Derrida's favorite formula that we all know, to deconstruct Marxism, and to deconstruct Marxism radically. And of course, this has to do with the conviction, a profound conviction that I have, and that I don't ask you, and not you, Bernard, and not anybody else, to share, at least because I say it or at face value, which is not that Marx has no relevance for our present. Absolutely not. I'm more convinced than I'm just as deeply convinced as I ever was that we need immediately and urgently some of Marx's concepts, propositions, analyses, even perhaps anticipations or predictions, to understand our present, to think in our present, and to think of our present as something that is not fixed, that is precisely in the course, taken in the course of a permanent transformation, and hopefully we can return to that. But I'm also completely convinced, not only this has become, of course, a kind of commonplace for et cetera, that any form of orthodox Marxism, so reduction of Marxism to a system that you could enclose, I would say, within the limited intellectual space, of course, of its principles on one hand, and its consequences or applications on the other hand, and with a kind of not necessarily linear but univocal trajectory leading from the principles to the consequences and the application. That's orthodox. That's what all the forms, the brands of orthodox Marxism always try to do. And the history, of course, of the past 2 centuries almost is a history of the permanent contestation and yes, deconstruction of this illusion and of this this imposture in many respects. So it's the history of the emergence of alternative Marxisms. They are alternative with respect to the existing orthodoxy and all the great names that we have in mind and that we study together today. Excuse me. One way or another belong to that series. Even those who were considered themselves members of organizations with a political line and therefore something like discipline. Okay, so not only alternatives to the orthodoxy, but alternatives with respect to one another, so that the idea of one Marxism is refuted by history, by the facts, and the only thing with which we can work, and that's is a multiverse. It's a multiplicity. It's a multiplicity. Of course, it's important and fascinating because the elements on which the different Marxisms are basing their constructions, their alternative constructions, are never entirely the same. That's an interesting, I'm sure that will emerge during this year. Some for, not only for some among the greatest readers of Marx, there is something like one text that is the key. For example, if our dear Tony Negri was still here, he would say, or he would have said at some time, yes, there's one place in the Grundrisse from which you have to derive your understanding. And then you select, of course, you can never catch everything, keep everything at the same level. But my point is more embarrassing, perhaps, or my position. It's something like not only we may reconstruct Marxism in different manners, but we must destroy Marx's problematic and see what remains of that. Okay, so that's a risk to take. Now, a few. Is that boring?
No.
Okay. No, it's long, but it's not boring. Okay. Not too boring. Okay. So let's come to the thesis. So I already said a few things, so I will simplify. Hopefully, simplify. Now, where does that text come from, and why is it the text that we read and see on the page? It's a pity that I didn't think of asking you to have the text of the thesis in triple mètre. Right. Better than Althusser. Put it there, please. Okay, so 11 aphorisms. 11 aphorisms. Numbered by whom? First question. From 1 to 11. With a title, sometimes or bracketed. So suggested title. And with a few minor, we'll say. Sometimes they are intriguing, but differences between the original, the Marxian manuscript, and the text that was published by Engels. And then two dates for the event, to locate the event that the writing and the publication and the reading and the of the thesis constitutes. So 1845, 1888. So it is in a book published in 1848 by Friedrich Engels, Marx's Peaceful Companion Bar, another one. Rather cool, older work. Book called Ludwig Feuerbach and the end in German Ausgang, which means the way out of, the end or the way out of German classical philosophy, where very famous formulas are to be read, such as the the proletariat is the true heir of the German philosophy. And so it is in this book that, as an appendix, Engels would propose the text of the thesis. And he says, of course, his subject is, among others, explain why it was so important, why it had such lasting consequences, why it is, in a sense, the originary secret, I would say, of Marx's philosophical and theoretical thinking, that it began as an Auseinandersetzung, a confrontation, fight, an intellectual fight, and a critique of Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach philosophy, a philosophy that at this time almost everybody has completely forgotten or left aside. That changed later. So at this moment, Marx is dead. He died in 1883, if I'm not mistaken. And Engels has embarked on the huge project, multiple project of one, continuing the work of Marx. Second, publishing everything that, or the important things that Marx had not had the time to complete and publish himself, especially the volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, and make this treasure, intellectual treasure, available for the militants, the activists of the great revolutionary movement, that is now progressively emerging in European countries, especially Germany, of course, under the name social democracy. Changed, not quite the same today. It's not Monsieur Cazeneuve. It's name socialists, Bebel, Liebknecht, and others, social democracy, and whose victory or success, that is capacity to replace the capitalist system with the socialist organization of the society. Engels, in contemporary texts, articles, describes as something which is not only predictable, but even measurable. You just have to look at the statistics that show the progress of the social democracy. So this project is systematic. It's politically oriented and effective, I would say. It aims at political efficacy and effectivity, and it is deeply pedagogic, essentially pedagogic. So that doesn't require the publication of the thesis on Feuerbach. But Engels reasons which perhaps are personal, because he says, I returned to these old manuscripts and I found the verification, evidence of the fact that the guiding line is a line that leads from the critique of Feuerbachian philosophy to what I'm now calling, because that was never said by Marx, I'm now calling historical materialism. So the line to be drawn is a line that leads from the critique of Feuerbach, philosophy, essentially his book, many other things as well, but on the essence of Christianity, and leads to the construction of the doctrine, Lehre in German, the doctrine that we will call historical materialism. And in order to make this more evident, an additional indication is necessary, that's plainly readable in the text, but namely, Feuerbach is a materialist. He's a materialist, but he's the wrong kind of materialism. Or he's a materialist in a sense that is of no use for politics in the sense that I was just alluding to, for revolutionary politics, whatever tactics or strategy you want to put under that, among other reasons, of course, because Feuerbach's naturalism and here materialism, and here we begin to see emerging one of these antitheses, these couples of notions that play such an overwhelming role in all these discussions. His materialism is naturalistic. Is naturalistic. It's the key concept. That's very strange to read today, because in a sense we're asked to finally understand that the reference to nature or the destruction of nature or the transformation of nature is something just as important and perhaps even more important than the kind of history that these people had in mind, the French Revolution and so on. So nevertheless, the critique is Feuerbach understands materialism in a naturalistic sense, and not, that's 1888, and not in a historic or historical sense, which goes, as we would have, with social, etc., etc. It's also humanist, but humanism, and I hope to be able to return to that, is a category that in fact is torn itself between a naturalistic and a historical or historicist understanding. So Engels' gesture amounts, of course, to identifying in the secret drawers that Marx had left behind him. Some people destroy their manuscripts, others keep them. It's a proof of the adequacy, I would say, the exactitude of this reconstruction. And there's a word in his text that, in a sense, summarizes this way of presenting things. It's the word in German. It's Keim, so it's the germ or the seed. I returned to this old manuscript, and I found there, with delight and amazement, the genial germ of the new Weltauffassung, conception of the world that includes philosophy, science, and politics and economy. Reason why I will now publish it as a an appendix of my text, which belongs to that project. Now that is a complete. It's not fake. I'm not saying it's not absurd. It's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary, but it's a construction. It's a construction, and this construction has some points of fragility, I would say, and they are the points from which I want to restart. But allow me an additional consideration of that. I do believe more than ever that the text that we have to do with here is a landmark. It's I'm tempted to say it's a miracle. It's a miracle in the history of writing and thinking. The passage of my old book, The Philosophy of Marx, I ventured to say, you'll think this guy, oh, okay, 60 years teaching philosophy on the benches of the faculty, is totally obsessed with his references. I said, if I read this text, and others do the same, of course, on the background of the history of Western, that's perhaps a limitation, but it's nevertheless quite broad, Western philosophy or Western metaphysics, this text, or some of its formulas, but they are closely knit with one another, produced and keep producing. You said we must read Marx in our actuality. Here we have to do with a kind of eternity, in a sense, rather than actuality. But this eternity, as every real one, the material one, so to speak, is made of the continuous repetition and reproduction of the action, of the effect of the text. So which other examples can we this is not a way to explain that Marx never did anything at the same level. No. It's on the contrary. It's a very strange specificity. So you think of Parmenides as inherited in fragments. To be and to think, that's the same. To think or to understand, knowing, or a few other formulas, but not very many. So I believe that the thesis and the publication of the thesis is a miracle, is a striking event, if you like, marks a break before writing, and therefore reading, and after such a text, complex of formulas, you no longer think in the same way and in the same terms. And this also probably has to do with the fact that if you look at the thesis, I said it a moment ago about the 11th, but it's true also of the others. Their status of enunciation is very strange. They're not really analytic. Philosophers who write in the form of aphorisms are many, and some more than fundamental references for us. So you'll think of Nietzsche, you'll think of Wittgenstein. Marx and Feuerbach wrote in aphorisms all the time, and many of his contemporaries. Marx only once apparently. But that time, at least, he achieved an extraordinary combination of, I would say, of propositions, because he says something about idealism, practice, etc., and positions. I would say this was used by many of our predecessors. Speech acts, which have a performative function. Now, the last thing that I want to say about that, and I jump to my more substantial final points, are two things. To add to your feeling, that that this text is very strange. If it is a foundation, if it can work as a foundation, it works as a foundation in the way in which, dare I use that, call that name, in which Heidegger, who in that case was in fact retrieving an old Neoplatonic idea, explained that what characterizes the foundation or the principle, arche, is that it shares absolutely no, or it shares no character or property with the things that derive from it. Now, translate that in a more simple and ordinary language, and return to the text, and try and remain faithful to the idea that Engels had in mind, namely that you could find here the germ of the new Marxist conception of the word. Normally, you expect that the key concepts of Marxism will be there, at least partly or implicitly, and practically there's none of them. So if this is a foundation for Marxism, this is a very strange foundation. There's no class struggle. There's no, yes, there's an idea of conflict or contradiction. We may have to return to that, but there's no class struggle. There is no production. There's praxis. There's no production, no labor process as the basic activity of humans. What a strange materialism is that, where the materiality of the work and the labor plays no role. Plays no role. There is no communism. There's a very bizarre use of the category social, to which we must return, and so on. And this is not because Marx doesn't know these, doesn't have these ideas at his disposal. Because if you relocate where Engels found the text in a drawer, as I said a moment ago, among many sheets of papers like that. And we know now, because of course the German erudites have studied that in detail, that he made choices. Of course, he picked up. So this, I'm not sure that I bet. I believe that they were numbered. That's of course the key to the use that he makes from 1 to 11. That's not Engels, that's Marx. But they have. And there were other notes, reflections mixed with them. So the key concepts are there, or many of the key concepts are there in all the other works, either published or unpublished, that Marx was writing or had been writing during the same period. And you'll have to return to that. So alienated labor, 1844 manuscript. In the thesis, you have, of course, alienation. That's key. That's crucial. That's a key concept. But no labor. Communism, proletariat, of course. 1844 introduction to the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of right and other texts. And immediately after that, so if we accept the idea that these notes were written in Brussels when Marx was forced to the minister, the Retailleau of the time, hunted him away, forced him to emigrate. So he had to leave France, where he was acquainted with many workers, revolutionaries, writers, and so on and so on. And after having had to leave Germany, Prussia, and moved first to Brussels and then to London. So you may imagine him in a hotel room like that, throwing some notes on paper. And immediately after that, he will embark. I will not say more about that. He will embark on a huge project. He's already published books, The Holy Family. He will embark on a huge project that remained unpublished, but which today is of course widely read and taken into account, the so-called German ideology. Except that what people read, and that's a consequence of the pedagogy of the socialist movement, is the part one, the first 80 pages again on Feuerbach, and they leave aside the most important, which is a mess, which is the critique of Stirner's anarchism, individualism. Okay, so the concepts are there. If they are not in the text, it's not because Marx would not know these names, these words: work, production, class, proletariat, communism, and so on. I don't say there's nothing that relates to that, but nevertheless, the absence is quite remarkable. And the result of the absence has been, that's quite remarkable as well. Do I have a little bit of time left? I begin to be boring, I know. The result of that is that all the readers of the thesis on Feuerbach, including Engels, but whether orthodox or heretics, if you like, have an almost irresistible tendency to smuggle into the thesis, or to insert into the thesis as explanations, explicitations of what is said there in such a cryptic and enigmatic manner, or as a better, as a necessary formulation of what is said by Marx. Several of the later or the other, I would say, Marxian concept. Bloch is very interesting. I come to him immediately. Is very interesting from this point of view, because if you had time to look, or you will have, I hope, time to look at his commentary, I'll say one thing more about it, its circumstances in a minute. You'll see that 2/3 of the commentary, literal commentary, there are so many such commentaries, beginning with the proposition to reorganize the thesis. That's very very strange, and not from 1 to 11, but 3 different groups, which each time include a thesis scattered or located at different places in the text. I think this is completely wrong. I cannot imagine Marx not writing the thesis in a single straight gesture, you know, and the numbers are not just from this point of view a superficial indications. So if there are convolutions, if you have the impression that something that had been said returns later with somewhat different characters and etc., it's of course, that's the labor of writing. I mean, that's exactly. So nevertheless, Bloch is a genial reader. So he begins with a commentary of the, and he wants the thesis to form a system. So he says there are three groups. One of them is I simplify, but one of them relates to the theory of knowledge. He's a good German student of Kant. So there is a kind of short equivalent of the critique of pure reason. Take thesis number 1 plus number 4 plus number 7, etc. This relates to knowledge, and the central idea is the idea of the criterion of practice as the absolute criterion of truth. And then you have the practical or the ethical and in fact anthropological dimensions centered, and that's of course inevitable, on the idea of alienation and the redefinition of what we should call the human nature or the human essence, thesis number 6. And then there is a synthetic group that leads us towards the culmination, namely the practical conclusion, why a revolutionary practice. So, but what I find amazing is the fact that he progressively introduces all the Marxian concepts. So the class point of view, he says, what is typical of what Marx called the point of view, Standpunkt, the point of view of the bourgeois, of the civil bourgeois society, is its class limitation. It's the relationship between its class limitation and its abstraction, or its individualistic abstraction. So class limitation. And then practice immediately bring back the idea that the fundamental praxis or practice is precisely labor or work, not exactly the same. So they all do that. They all do that with two exceptions, two remarkable exceptions. First, Gramsci. If I had room and time and had time for that, I would have suggested not only to read through the eyes of Bloch, but also, of course, Gramsci. But Gramsci is extremely difficult to use here because Gramsci didn't write a systematic commentary. Gramsci writes in his prison his notebooks, which are themselves a continuous fight against contemporary versions of Marxism or interpretations of Marx. And again, he returns to the thesis on Feuerbach that he doesn't really quote or discuss in detail, but whose effect, I would say, on our reading of Marx is interested in. And this effect, I hope you follow me, this effect is concentrated in one remarkable idea, which also shows that Gramsci, strangely, that was not Engels, that was has Marx on one side of his desk and Machiavelli on the other one. He says all the Marxists, or the orthodox Marxists, are obsessed. I was referring a moment ago to Engels' idea that we can predict the final victory of the working class socialist, social democratic movement and almost calculate. And if there is something that Gramsci finds absolutely nonsensical, it's precisely that idea. So he returns to the thesis of Feuerbach in order to explain that what to justify the idea that what the Marxian point of view, the Marxian point of view on politics and on history and on philosophy allows us to ascertain, and I find this in the present particularly necessary as with conviction and arguments, is not the fact that there is a historical tendency that leads from capitalism to communism through a socialist revolution of whatever kind. It's only the fact that there is in the history of capitalism, co-immanent in that history, inseparable from that history, a contradiction that cannot be suppressed, that cannot be erased, and that expresses itself in the form of conflict, class struggle, if you like. So there will be struggle, and the result, and that will not be eliminated. And the result of that struggle is necessary in a sense. It's determined by its own forms and conditions, but it's not written in advance. It's not written in advance, and especially not in the form stage one dictatorship of the proletariat, stage two collectivization of the means of production, stage three, blah 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 blah. That was already the case at Gramsci's time, a matter that was not only speculative but in fact practical, existential and tragic. You could be sent to the gulag if you had the wrong theory about the number of stages between the dictatorship of the proletariat and the final communist result. And I have a funny but also sad memory of an encounter with 3 Chinese philosophers and members of the Academy of the Sciences in Beijing. After, and not at the time of the Cultural Revolution, but after the new regime, with whom at Nanterre we had a discussion. They wanted to meet French Marxist philosophers. So the ministry said, go to Nanterre, that's where they're all located. They arrived at Nanterre and the presidency said, go to the Department of Philosophy. And the director of the department said, we have 3 Marxist philosophers in our department. So the 3 of us, Andréani, Bidet, and myself sat on one side of the table and the 3 Chinese philosophers on the other side. And we quarreled about I asked the silly question, which stage did you reach in the transition from advanced socialism to communism? And the guy started as Marx explains in his critique of the Gotha program, there are 2 stages between capitalism and socialism. I said, I cut you because in the Gotha program, Marx never uses the word socialism. He said, what? I wrote a whole book on that. So that was not. So Gramsci is of course using the thesis on Feuerbach in order to direct our attention towards, at the same time, the Wirklichkeit, the reality, and even the materiality of the historical process, and the uncertainty of its final result. And Althusser is a very strange case that we won't have time to discuss because, and he's been, of course, stigmatized so many times for that, because in a text at the end of the volume 4 Marx, he says, all the formulas of the thesis are in fact nonsensical. They mean nothing. They mean nothing in theory as a theoretical concept. They have a practical function. He invents an extraordinary notion, which is the notion of practical concepts, which he compares with. This is a little bit of Wittgenstein in that. He compares with not with pictures, not with descriptions or representations of the reality, but with, he says in French, poteau indicateur. On the street, you have these, what's in English for that? The directions.
Yeah, directions, landmarks.
The direction. If you want to go, take that direction. And that's a remarkable idea, which has something very strong, but it leads to a dead end, namely, instead of reading what Marx has written, we ought to substitute other words, because we know, as different from Marx at the time, always this idea of anticipation. We know where to go, whereas he was trying to find it. Okay, so I want to add one thing about Blanc. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So one thing about Blanc. I had a memory of why I found Blanc's commentary so important. And so I said to Bernard, this is the commentary that we need to take into account, first of all. And then I returned to the text, and I was a little afraid because I thought maybe I won't find it there. Yes, it's there. The one thing that it's a fascinating commentary. It's a great piece of philosophy. The one reason why I find that Bloch is crucial. Oops. His invention, his addition, is the supplement. Don't worry, don't worry. The supplement that he introduces in Marx's terminology. So Marx writes in Thesis 11, philosophers have interpreted the world. Incidentally, a very strong idea in Althusser. I reconstructed this presentation that Althusser gave us in a seminar in 1961. You know, I lost my notes, so I don't know where they are, etc. But I reconstructed, and of course, the key idea is that the theses are structured with an opposition between so-called ancient materialism and new materialism, with an intermediary, with a mediation, which is idealism, so that you can try and distribute, I would say, the formulas that he quotes or discusses or criticizes among any of the three philosophical tendencies, if you like, or not doctrines, but tendencies. Either they represent or they are typical of the ancient materialism, Feuerbach and before the 18th century French materialists, or they are typical of idealism, which means German idealism and after Kant, and or they form part of the new materialism that I, Marx, am trying to elaborate. But and that can be discussed, but one of the strong points, of course, is using this topography to explain that interpreting the world can be done equally or indiscernibly almost from in a materialist language or in an idealist language, so that from this point of view, all the philosophers are on the same boat, if you like. And then, of course, you come to the positive counterpart, namely, es kommt darauf an. The point is change the world, change the world. And the German, forgive me for this pedantic, the German word is sie zu verändern. This is a very ordinary word in German, of course. Transform, change is a better translation than transform. Verändern means literally make other. It's the idea of the very general idea of alteration. Of course, you may think that a revolution is an alteration of a very radical and typical kind. So this doesn't preclude you from introducing it. But if you keep to the connotations, the most general connotation of the idea of changing and changing, I tend to believe that a broader scope of possibilities opens itself. Again, you say, this is really impossible, always allusions and accidental reflections. But nevertheless, one of the most interesting accidents, I would say, that happened to the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and philosophers not always remember that, I mean, some of course know it, took place in 1935. At the time, we think of that now because of the circumstances in which we are. At the great Congress of anti-fascist intellectuals that was organized in Paris, you know that, in Paris. The Communist Party was the driving force behind that Congress, but not all the participants were communists, and especially not orthodox communists, of course. So the surrealists were taking part in the Congress, and André Breton personally could not come there because he was not on speaking terms with some of the party leaders. So he sent representatives, not anybody, the poet Paul Eluard, and Eluard, in the name of Breton, pronounced this loud, this beautiful statement before the Congress in French. Transformer le monde, a dit Marx. It's very well known. Transformer le monde, a dit Marx. Change la vie, a dit Rimbaud. Ces deux mots d'ordre, pour nous, n'en font qu'un. Ces deux mots d'ordre, pour nous, n'en font qu'un. Which seems to suggest that something is missing, in a sense, from Marx's formula, that Rimbaud would help us introduce. The poetic element, and of course also the existential dimension. So you can push that to the extreme. Transformer le monde means the capitalist structures, the ownership of the means of production, the market, etc., etc. These are institutions. They are object-like structures, oppressive, of course. And the revolutionary process aims at destroying and reconstructing these structures. The existential element apparently plays no role. So bring it back, and bring it back through the necessary detour of art and poetry. I don't say that Marx harbored, so to speak, a Rimbaud within himself, etc. But you can have a slightly more dialectical vision of things, in which it's not just a question of adding something that would be missing, but rather of making manifest and clear a dimension that is implicit and could possibly be forgotten. This becomes clearer, I believe. Of course, the very Rimbaldian formula says it: transformer le monde, change la vie. It's useful to have two words, but it's no longer necessary to see them as external to one another or antithetic with one another. If you adopt the translation as change, and now back to Bloch, and then Bloch writes the following, which I summarize. He says the idea of changing the world, and even more, that's of course the moment when the philosophical, the speculative dimension of the thesis comes to the fore. The idea, allow me to put another German word on the idea of a selbst, sorry for the pedantic, a Selbstveränderung. So a self-transformation, the idea of a transformation of oneself. So, which is there once in the thesis, but very centrally, and which clearly echoes the other speculative formula that you also find in the same number, I believe it's 4, namely, not there because I don't have the text, namely the idea that what characterizes this world or this social world, it's a social world, whose mystical, fantastic reflection, I will probably not have time to speak about that, is the religious system of ideas, is self-alienation, Selbstentfremdung. So the course of the change, is a transition, from the alienation of self to the change or the transformation of self. So who is self? Would be tempted to say self is all of us and each and every of us in particular. It's the subject who is at the same time, that's very Hegelian, individualized and totalized or collectivized, call it a society if you like. So this transition is possible. You can think of it, says Bloch. It becomes thinkable only if you admit, as this is just adding a little twist to the Marxian formula, if you admit that what characterizes the world, what Marx calls the world, which is neither subjective and not objective, nor objective structures, etc., and not subjective, that is, not lived as such. Otherwise, the idea of alienation would make no sense. So what must characterize this world is and so it sounds very ugly in French and English, it's Veränderbarkeit, it's transformability, And I always thought, and I keep thinking, that with this very small suggestion or addition, if you like, Bloch touches a crucial and fundamental aspect of the philosophy or the ideas of the thesis. In other terms, it's a way of explaining that, of course, the world is not before us as something that we decide to change. And in order to decide to change the world, we form a party, we adopt theoretical ideas, we teach ourselves historical materialism, and then we tackle it, so to speak. Because we are not outside that world. There's another element of terminology in the thesis that is very interesting and very strong from this point of view. I believe it's in the thesis, I'm not sure, 2 perhaps, where Marx speaks about the criterion of truth, and he says the proof or the evidence of the reality of our thoughts can be given only by practice. But besides reality, he also uses another German term, which is Diesseitigkeit. So simple translation would be immanence, as opposed to, but that comes from the religious terminology. It's the opposition between Diesseits, that is, what's the English for that? Ici-bas. Yes.
Down here.
Sorry?
Down here.
Down here. Down here. As opposed to Jenseits, on the other side, beyond death, in the transcendent realm, the heavenly realm. So the transformation or the change is a movement rooted in the transformability of the world of ici-bas. So, and that's I will conclude with that. I've spoken too much. That's a very interesting point, because starting from there, you can go into different directions which contemporary philosophy has tried to travel, of course. If you are a Bergsonian or even a Deleuzian, and I'm not saying that against Deleuze, of course, your philosophy is a very strong philosophy of immanence, and the idea of immanence is inseparable from the idea of becoming. So reality, the real, which we may want to call the world, is not subjective, it's not objective, it's becoming as such. Now, the question, of course, immediately arises of the orientation of that becoming, and Marx, and therefore I'm not against that kind of reading, but I believe that Gramsci's suggestion, nevertheless, here has to be taken into account, and this is also where Bloch wants to go. Bloch wants to avoid, at the same time, to use the thesis with a little addition of the transformability, not just the transformation, but transformability, in order to criticize from the inside. In fact, I'll say one quick thing about the date. The orthodox Marxist view that I was referring to several times, namely that comes from Hegel and others. There is a course of history. There's a line of history. So the dialectical transformation of human societies leads from one stage to the next stage. And if that is the case, in Bloch's formula, there will be no novum. That is, nothing unexpected will arise. We'll only reach the logical conclusion and consequence of the development of the contradictions in the world that we have inherited from the past and that we inhabit. There's a formula for that in Marx that Marxists repeatedly quoted. And I tend to believe today and to assert, not boldly, but with fear, that this is if Marx once said something that is wrong, it is that. It's the famous formula in the preface to the 1859 critique of the political economy. Humankind, die Menschheit, never assigns itself, sets up problems, or in the German Aufgaben or tasks, that it cannot resolve. Because if you look closer, that is, if you look at the dialectics of the transformation of the world that is on its way, you will see, you will discover that within the contradictions that characterize that words, the elements of its very solution are being formed, particularly, of course, the revolutionary class, etc. If something, unfortunately, is wrong, as proved and proves wrong, and is not only unnecessary but harmful and catastrophic in our times of catastrophe, it's precisely the idea that humankind only faces or addresses or sets itself tasks and problems that it can resolve. Nothing is less certain than that. But the conclusion is not that you jump to the other extreme, although that could be also worked, elaborated in interesting manners that could lead you to Benjamin. The continuation of the present is the catastrophe. Which kind of recourse do we have with respect to that? A miracle or an opening of time, a Jetztzeit, an instant in which the repressed past will return and reveal its latent or suppressed possibilities. Bloch is neither on one side or on the other. He believes that there is a becoming, that history is a becoming, whose central characteristic is what he also calls concrete possibility or concrete utopia, namely the emergence in the present of antithetic forms or contradictory movements and ways of life that make the impossible possible. You could put it like that. So that's what I am tempted to read in his behind his invention. Now it's interesting to remember when that was written. That was written in 1953, and of course here perhaps a few people are. In 53, I was 11 years old, didn't know very much about European politics, but soon after that I became completely obsessed and drowned in all that tradition. And of course, I learned about it. 1953 is the year in which the workers in East Germany revolted against the Stalinist system. May, June of 1953, and were, of course, suppressed, like later the Hungarian Revolution, the Prague Spring, and others. But these are better remembered. I don't know why. And this is the year when Bertolt Brecht wrote this extraordinary poem that he did not dare publish, of course, but that was published after his death. The party has explained to the masses, to the people, that know that they have revolted and this revolt has been punished, they must work hard and learn their lessons about, I quote of memory, about the rules of socialism and historic becoming. Wouldn't it be simpler if the party decided to dissolve the people and elect a new one, which is a fantastic. I believe that Bloch writes in that spirit. He writes in that spirit. So the little shift from change to changeability, if you understand it like that, I hope I could make sense of that. Okay, I had lots of things in mind which I haven't had time to explain, but perhaps I should stop there.
Okay, well, let's do this. I'd like to raise some questions as to what you just did for us. Do you want to take a small break first? No? No, okay.
Yes, if you give me 1 minute.
1 minute?
Two,
You want 2 minutes? Okay, très bien. Let's do 2-minute break, and then, attention, c'est à gauche, okay? 2-minute break. 2-minute break, and then we'll continue the conversation, okay? And incidentally, this table, as well as another one from Étienne, is on the website. So you can just download it right there. It's on the website, as well as an introduction that I wrote to try and give you some background for those who might be interested. Okay? All right, we'll just take a 2-minute break for... Bon, bien. Vous pouvez signer plus tard si vous voulez.
I can understand that some people needed to go.
Bien. All right. Let's start up again then. All right.
Well, this is your.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, what have you done for us, my dear Étienne? So, I think what you've done is very important. A bit defensive, I would say, but very important for us. You have kind of deconstructed what Engels tried to do with this piece and creating historical materialism. You have de-systematized Marx in a way for us. You have de-dogmatized a particular Marx that we have come to know, and that we have come to know in part through this text, the short Theses on Feuerbach. Now, you've done it in part, I take it, because you are trying to salvage Marx from various forms of dogmatic Marxism. And in the process, trying to undo the systematization of Marx in order to recoup a series of concepts and argumentative moves that could benefit us today. And I think this is something that you've done for you're not only doing that today, it's something that you've done in your work on Marx. Now, and it's interesting, of course, that you would choose a text like the Theses on Feuerbach to enter into our reading of Marx in order to so deconstruct it immediately, right? We spoke a lot about what are the different ways in which you could enter Marx's texts? Which texts do you use as a kind of a can opener to get into the opus, the work, and the multiplicity of texts over those years, and the chronological understanding that, in a way, we are going to be taking in order to help us with our own readings. But how do you actually, where do you come in? Through reading what text? And you chose this, in a way, this fetish text, right? That has so much, or has been so systematized in different ways, right? In order to try and break that open and eliminate for us those ready-made systematizations. Okay, I think that's what you did for us, which I think is extremely, well, it's brilliant and also extremely helpful for us starting into this work. Now, you made some claims. In order to do that, you made some claims that were provocative. And in their provocation, I think went a little further necessarily, or could be misinterpreted in a way. So for instance, when you say there's no class struggle, there's no production, there's no communism, when you talk about the fact that the text is a landmark, a miracle, when you said, for instance, that it is aphoristic, right? It certainly is the case that it enters into the pantheon of philosophical icons through the 11th thesis predominantly, right? I mean, most people know the 11th thesis and couldn't recite any other one, right? Or most people can recite the 11th thesis and wouldn't be able to even interpret the other ones.
That's
right. But in that it enters the pantheon of these formulas that we can refer to, and that you refer to, Parmenides and others, Kant's and Spinoza's, and those formulas. It enters that, but and here are a few buts then. First, I don't read it as aphorisms. I read it as, and of course, everyone has their commentary dangerously, right? I read it as the way we jot down an argument we're trying to make that we don't want to forget. It's not so much aphoristic as it is synthetic arguments for purposes of formulating a critique of Feuerbach, I would say. And what it then contains are a series of important moves, a series of important arguments that, yes, ils se recoupent. They overlay each other. They cover each other. They interrupt each other. Whatever. It's not an accident that Bloch and everybody else reorganizes them, because when we read them, we all see slightly different important pieces that don't form a logical argument, right? It is not 1, 2, 3, 4, therefore 11. It's more like, well, okay, yeah, okay, right. There are these important arguments and concepts. There is a historical process in here. There is a historical process, right? I mean, there's actually that's number 6, right? To abstract from the historical process is to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual. So there is an important element of history. There is an idea that those were the old materialists, right? That's not just Engels imposing that here.
No,
That's
Engels, yes.
Thesis 10, right? The old materialists is civil society, and the new materialists are human society or social humanity. There is a notion, of course, of civil society as different from this socialized humanity and the human society. Of course, all these things you recognize. I mean, I understand that these are, you more than anyone recognize this, in fact, because all that I'm suggesting in a way is that these are the concepts that are important to you, right? And that you, in a way, extract from this text without the imposed systematicity that others have done, right? But those concepts are there. And of course, the most important one somehow is the idea of practice. Well, maybe, okay, foolish to say the most important one.
No, go ahead.
But
back
yeah,
from your thesis.
Okay. I mean, the reason because it's only because practice is the foundation of knowledge. I mean, these are all things that are explicit in this text. I take it. I don't think I'm projecting here.
No.
Practice is the basis of knowledge, meaning without practice, we cannot know, right? Practice is also the basis of the new materialism. It's also the way in which we can destroy received concepts of abstract family and abstract civil society, right? That's number 4. And so, at the heart of it is the idea that knowledge is practical, that Feuerbach missed this because of the abstraction and the idealism and the pure contemplation, rather than actually acting on the material of life, being a part of the material of life, that then, and so jot down the arguments here, that then, gives us the necessity to get beyond the isolated human individual, beyond the individual in civil society, the Hegelian notion of civil society, and get to, it's the only thing that's going to teach us is practice, to get to the individual in human society in conflict, right? And of course, and there is a notion of conflict here, regardless of whether we want to project class struggle on there, there is a notion of fundamental conflict in society, which is what resulted in the projection and the separation of the earthly and the heavenly, and leading ultimately to these ideas of transformation, self-transformation, that I would say are not only in the 11th thesis,
No.
but that are also in the third thesis,
Third, of
right?
course. That's where you
Men make
find
history,
that's
are
where
in
the-
charge of transformation. That we need, in which case we need to educate the educators. The idea there, right? The reproduction and education. It's in number 8 as well. All mysteries find their solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. It's in number 4, destroying the abstract idea of the Holy Family, and of course in number 11, right? So it starts in a way. These concepts then can be, as your work has shown, I think, extremely productive to us in our own thinking and in our own ways of understanding the world, in our own practices, take it. Now, it's not then so much, so what is the problem of smuggling in the later Marx in a way? Where does that,
Yes.
where does that come? I take it the problem with smuggling in the later Marx, or trying to use words as a key to the later Marx, which, okay, so which is done mostly with the notion of conflict, right? It's in 6, right? No, it's not in 6. The
What are you looking
conflict,
for?
the conflict, the conflict, the
contradiction?
contradiction, where we
Four.
then, yeah, it's in 4.
Four.
Yeah.
4. But
Uh,
that's
Religious into its secular basis, right? You
Yes.
consistently resolve the religious into
Yes.
secular basis. Within secular basis, the latter must therefore in itself be both understood in its contradiction and revolutionized in practice. Thus, for instance, okay, we discover and we can discover and destroy as a result of that. Okay, and the question is, we might not. I mean, you're entirely right that it would not. It might not be helpful to kind of project the later Marx into a word or a term like this, in order to avoid the systematization that would take place. But nevertheless, it's important to retain and to then try and figure out the question of the contradiction, where it comes from, what it is about, and what it's going to accomplish. Now, I don't think you would disagree with this, because I think that this is what you've done in your work. It's to work out.
You often disagree with what you've done in your work.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. So feel free to disagree with what you've done in your work. I'll glean from it. I'll glean from it, right? Which is these different landmarks. Let's say landmarks in a summary of an argument. And the question then becomes, if we can salvage these, or if we take this different view of the theses on Feuerbach, or if we use the theses on Feuerbach this way to kind of like open up the terrain and look into this body of work, as we are going to do this year, what are the moves that can help us think the present today? Right. And of course, that's our goal. At least that's my goal, and I'm hoping we can all.
I wish that you reach that goal.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yes. It's and Bloch would also wish that we reach that goal,
I'm sure
right?
others want to say something. Can I
Yeah, I want you to respond.
Yes.
I want you to respond with the mic. But before I do, I just want to say one last thing, which is that one of the important contributions and moves here in the theses was the strategic way in which he uses Feuerbach to advance a possible to advance his own theoretical framework. Feuerbach, who he felt was the one who had so powerfully started to question and to displace Hegelian idealism, right? And so I think that one really important piece is beyond just the concepts. It's the actual strategic move that is represented in this piece and in other pieces as well, German ideology, before that, the Holy Family as well. The strategic move of trying to build on the work of Feuerbach to actually push it further. Okay, so Étienne.
Shall I reply something?
Yes.
Of course, you put me before the not only the weakness but the absurdity of what I have done, which it's too late now to start again. Of course, amounted to talking about the status and the effect and the resonances of the thesis on Feuerbach in my mind and some others, without really reading the text and trying to explain at least partially why these words are there and how they are combined and assembled. So you're, from this point of view, you're terribly right. And okay, but so allow me to not to justify, but to throw into the discussion on this point two things that I wanted to introduce. First of all, what do I think is the philosophical intentionality, I mean, the orientation of this exercise? I maintain, I stick to the idea that this is an exercise in writing. Perhaps it's my imagination. I try to identify with the guy behind his table in the hotel room in Brussels. In my imagination, he's not summarizing either what he has done before or what he plans to do later. Things that he did several times. There are several texts of Marx which can be interpreted like that: plans, projects. He's very materially trying to combine the words in order to have them say something. And so the object of thought on the horizon, you say it's a theory of practice. I'd return to that. You're absolutely right. Of course, impossible to deny that practice is the, or perhaps one of the key concepts in the text. And everything turns around the understanding of that notion and the function we grant it. But just like Bloch and others, I smuggle into the text a notion that is not explicitly there. With the help of Bloch, I think the horizon of the text is understanding not history, not the historical character of human psychologies, social structures, the contingency, the succession, the transformation, etc., but historicity as such. And that's why there is a latent, of course, Feuerbach is there, there's a latent affinity, I would say, of that text, and at the same time, a singularity, because he is reducible to none other. With all the great modern philosophers whose object was precisely that, historicity. If you want, the driving force of history, the driving force of history, or the modality in which we generalize the idea of history, so that not only we are immersed in that element, but our only hope or objective can be to add something or orientate this movement of history in a new direction. Mm-hmm. So that's why I find Feuerbach and so interesting, because if you like, of course, the term is the problem now is to change the world. The key notion is change, but the latent idea is how to change the change. So that's where, of course, not only a notion of becoming is useful, but also, of course, I would say, and I borrow this very without hesitation from contemporary post-Foucauldian and others' work on that notion, a notion of subjectivation. Philosophers who read the thesis on Feuerbach quarreled interminably, Althusser, Goldman, and others, around the question: is there a subject of politics and history in this text? And the best possible answer is, of course, the name for the subject is practice, and I accept that. That's what Althusser never. That's why he wanted to. He didn't want to stay there. And that was his mistake. I would. So we may agree on the idea that the name for the historical subject in Marx at this moment is practice, with all its conditions, resonances, and correlates. But it seems to me that we must introduce an element of reflexivity, so to speak, and that's why the insistence in the German text of this typically German idealist terminology, selbst something, the self-realization, the self-transformation, the self-alienation, and so on, I find so interesting. It's funny to see that the translators have problems with that. That's where the speculative German, for example, in the English translation, in thesis number 4, and I'll return to that, where he describes the alienation as Selbstzerrissenheit and Selbstwidersprechen. So with Selbstwidersprechen, self-contradiction or contradicting oneself, the translator doesn't have too many problems. So he writes self-contradiction. But Selbstzerrissenheit, to what's zerrissen? It's in English. It's déchiré in French.
Tear apart,
Tear apart. So it's almost untranslatable, but you see the idea. It's the Otontimoroumenos, the guy who is. It's like in the Greek mythology. I mean, it's the god who tears apart his own body, etc. And except here, this god is Menschheit, the humanity. So the translator writes cleavage. Cleavage. So that's perhaps he has a little bit of Freud in mind, but that's, of course, that's not the so this element of reflexivity is key to the understanding of the text, adds to the simple notion of praxis in as much as it introduces the element of reflexivity. Therefore, I would be tempted to say, I know I'm no longer cannot prove that, but it's a feeling, if you like. But I would be tempted to say that better than explaining that the name for the subject, or the revolutionary subject, or the collective subject, or the social subject, blah blah, in the thesis is practice. It's important to understand that practice is a name, the name that points, I would say, at not subjectivity, but subjectivation. Subjectivation, a process of subjectivation. There's no other subject than the one who is not only immersed, but immanent, I would say, in a process of subjectivation. And the quality or the essential character of this process is to be practical. So that takes me, sorry, I'm trying to my second point. One of the good sides of Althusser's little class tableau, topography, that was very pedagogic. This was the first year we were reading Marx with him. So but he meant it. Is of course to direct our attention to the huge paradox that is lies at the core of his thesis, namely the fact that so in a very Hegelian or quasi-Hegelian manner, the final philosophical position or proposition called just once in the text, the new materialism or the coming materialism, is called materialism, whereas all the fundamental, almost all, I would say, with one exception, all the categories that will make it possible for us to understand the structure or the meaning of that materialism derive from the idealist tradition. So this materialism is a materialism without any matter, not even nature. That will not always be the case in Marx. Very soon after that, he writes the German ideology. You have matter and matter all everywhere all the time. Men are struggling with their material conditions of existence. And if you don't understand that everything in history is rooted in this daily struggle and effort to transform the external natural conditions into something that you can eat and drink and houses in which you can live, etc. The material basis of the society of history, if you forget about that, you're a pure idealist. You believe that history follows from the development of some abstract ideas. Turn back, please, to the hard material. None of that here. None of that. Absolutely none of that. This is a materialism it's momentary. It's perhaps wrong. He realized he should change his formulations, but it's a materialism without matter. It's a materialism centered on the notion of practice and the notion of the social. The social. What is the material basis for the understanding of religion are the social relations and the contradictions that are immanent in these social relations. So I don't say that this is not materialist, but it's materialist in a very paradoxical way. And more than that, the first thesis, there is a kind of circle between the first and the last, explicitly says, and you must take this very seriously, where do we find the categories that we need to transform the old material? We find them in the idealist tradition. And that's not difficult to interpret, because the very vocabulary says it for anybody at the time and even today. Tat, action, Tätigkeit, activity, etc. That comes directly from the great idealists. Kant, Fichte above all, and all the young Hegelians were in fact Fichtians, and Hegel perhaps to some extent, but in any case you have to. So in this when you put and some very good commentators went to the conclusion that at the heart, the center of the thesis, is a kind of ontology of practice, an ontology of practice. I tried something different in my little book, and which I developed in other places. I said it's an ontology of relations, because I took the thesis number 6 as my center of interpretation instead of number 1. But I completely understand why you can say that it's an ontology of practice. But I repeat, the categories that will make it possible for you to build that ontology or quasi-ontology or this idea of the real, if you prefer, they are not coming from the materialist, the officially materialist tradition. So except one, and that's not nothing, I believe, which accounts for the continuous, not only importance, but rumination, I would say, of the Feuerbachian legacy in Marx's thinking at the time, and perhaps even later, which is what the text in German calls die Sinnlichkeit, the senses, the sensuous element. So that's something that the idealists not only ignore, but reject, repress. And why that? Very quick, because they are haunted by religious notions of the opposition, not between the object and the subject, but between the flesh, the body, and the body is on one side, and the spirit or something of that kind on the other side. So the paradoxical move, and so in that sense, Feuerbach, with all his absurdities from Marx's point of view, etc., he touches an element without which, I'm cautious, without which your concept of the real is in fact completely ideal. And that's the senses. So the gamble of the thesis resides, I would say, in the combination, not forecast in previous philosophy, of not only sensibility, but sensuousness on one side, and practice or action. Or perhaps you might want to say you find yourself in the element of practice or praxis if you think action in the element of the sense of the senses. And that's the paradoxical materialism that the thesis tried to build. And I agree, if it is true, of course, I agree that this is an extremely, perhaps today less than at the time, but an extremely original and strong and provocative way of writing philosophy. See what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, to combine the critique, the valorization of activity in idealism, which is in the first thesis, with the sensuousness, I take it, that is in the Feuerbach, right? And then to add the practice is what gives you ultimately the new materialism.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm right, but I perceive that in the text. Now you will ask me, I had proposed a kind of other little topography of concepts. If we want to verify this in intuition, we must introduce a commentary and an interpretation of other key elements. First, alienation. What does he mean by alienation? And second, what does he mean by social relation? And I believe that the two are very closely interrelated. Perhaps I'm influenced by the fact that I'm a late 20th century philosopher or professor of philosophy, and so some of our masters and on that point, and here I'm not thinking of Foucault, perhaps Foucault, certainly not Deleuze, but Lacan, undoubtedly. Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, from which other Lacanians have derived the generalization. Il n'y a pas de rapports sociaux. Pourquoi? Why? Because social relations are always already sexual. And since there is no sexual relation, there's no social relation. But what does that mean? It's a provocation. That mean it means that you cannot think of non-alienated relations. And certainly the text here entirely revolves around the articulation of these two ideas. So I would suggest that if you read very radically the thesis number 6, which Althusser, and he was right, deemed absurd, if you like, or based on a paradox, on a logical contradiction. The essence of the human is a non-essence. It's an ensemble or a system of social relations. You reach the idea that I propose in other texts, that what Marx is explaining that's very clear in the text. I mean, otherwise his critique of individualism, bourgeois individualism, and even Feuerbachian individualism would make no sense. You don't have first individuals, after which they enter into social relations. Marx has written that in other places. In the life, men enter social relations, which are relations of exploitation. here, the writing here is more radical than that. That's why it's so interesting. Because it rules out the idea that you have first individuals or subjects or however you want to call them, after which you have intersubjectivity. We could discuss interactions. Before the interactions, there are no individuals. So the individuals are nothing else, are nothing other than the agents, the actors, the functions, perhaps, the results, the lived, the existential counterpart of these relations. Now, which relations? Social relations. And I maintain what I said in other places. I maintain that social is infinite in range potentially. There's no idea at this point of social relations that would be, so to speak, more social than others or more decisive than others in the construction or the framing of the society. Sexual intercourse is a relation just as well, potentially at least, I mean, as well as labor in whichever social form. But then from there you jump to the question of alienation. And my suggestion is, so replying to Lacan or something like that, that is, yes, of course, there doesn't exist something in history or in human experience as pure or perfect or natural social relations precisely that precede or come before the alienated forms of domination, religion, disposition, etc. So the only form in which in history, in the present, you find the social relations is their alienated form. But this alienated form is not blocked. It's not stuck. It's not immobile. It's to say that it is contingent is not enough. You have to say something more, where again the idea of the Feuerbachite becomes useful. Because the core of the alienation are these phenomena of Selbstzerrissenheit and Selbstwidersprechen, an internal conflict, which tears apart the human and makes him, or makes them rather, permanently contradicting their own status, no, not status, but their own, I'm tempted to say their own conatus, I mean their own desire, yes, to live. This is highly unstable, and therefore the essence, so to speak, of this relational complex is not just the present alienation, but it's the tendency towards the revolutionary overcoming of the alienation itself, whose conditions of possibility and energy, if you like, entirely lies in the alienation itself. And that's also why, and I'll stop there. I'm talking idle. That's also why again, returning to Feuerbach, I believe that the confrontation with Feuerbach is very interesting because there has been a tendency in later Marxism, the orthodox, if you want to, as you said, the one that I had taken as my target and my adversary, to reduce with terrible political consequences the question of religion to a kind of generic problem of ideology. Or even I shouldn't, you said to me, don't quote my essay because Bernard sent me 20 pages. And I find what you say very inspiring. But forgive me if I simplify, but somewhere you say behind the question of religion is a more important and more fundamental question, which is the question of idealism. I believe just the opposite. But I believe that if you start asking questions about the kind of alienated life that religion names and organizes, this is more fundamental than idealism as a system of ideas or even institutions. Again, because it has this existential dimension that touches the question of the senses, the materiality that Marx here has in mind. Therefore, the description. Of course, you are not. You're perfectly right to go in other directions. Connect this with something that Marx wrote later and say, yes, this problem of historicity never disappeared. This problem of the immanent tendency from within alienation itself to become revolutionary transformation. This was always Marx's problem, and he developed it in terms of capitalist exploitation, class struggles, and things like that. But in this text, if you stick to its moment and its modality of writing, I perceive the idea that Feuerbach touches a very deep, not so secret, but very deep element of alienated life, which religion expresses and names. And from there, I stop there. You can jump in other directions. For example, you have in mind a famous text of Walter Benjamin where he says, capitalism, after all, is a religion. So if we want to go to the roots of the alienated individuality in the capitalist society, we must realize that capitalism did not cancel the religious element. It just entirely reorganized it around other fetishes.
I think we should open it up to the floor. Anyone who wants to intervene, ask questions. I should note, just as a footnote to what you were just saying, that we'll be turning actually in Marx 413. We'll be continuing this conversation because we're going to have the philosopher Renata Saleko reading the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 in conversation with Lacan's formulations of the unconscious. So I think that the whole, this conversation on alienation, and particularly in conversation with Lacan, we'll be having for, or we'll continue with on Marx 1313. So I hope you'll join us for that. But why don't we open it up to folks who have questions? And you have a question? Let me give you the.
They're still alive. Yes,
Thank you so much. In fact, it was really enlightened to be here and use this seminar. But I just want to, because that's kind of related somehow to my thesis, and that's really interesting to me to know about that. That's a dilemma for me. I want, rather than all of the things that you mentioned, and we were totally agree with that, this concept of new materialism over there that you believe it would be could be called relational materialism, maybe, rather than practical materialism. Somehow I believe that, in fact, in Althusserian way, we could say that, in fact, relation is part of the component of the practice. But I want to ask somehow so simple question. What today, what would be the benefit, the merit, the use of this demarcation of I know that that question would be so controversial in Marxist context, but what would be the use of, would be the benefit of the demarcation of materialism, idealism today, politically, epistemologically, philosophically? I can understand, for example, in the period of the Marx and Engels, yeah, that was a kind of critique of ideology, maybe, because the prominent trend of the philosophy over there was a kind of Hegelianism, and somehow, the things that we can find in the introduction of the book, German ideology, not German idealism. But I want to ask you if you could shed light on that question. What is the benefit of this demarcation? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure I'll shed light, but I will tell you frankly and brutally, this idea of the great demarcation between materialism and idealism is a philosophical and political disaster. Not only I have no use of that, but I think that we must get rid of it. Yeah, yes. Would be, yes. It would be interesting. It would be interesting to clarify completely the moment when the idea of this dichotomy was introduced and justified as a kind of undisputable philosophical framework, and then became associated, that's of course Lenin, with the idea that to do philosophy it's redundant. To do philosophy in a materialist way means that you choose a party, a side, in the great conflict that supposedly runs all along history since the beginning to the end. So that's not Eros and Thanatos, that's idealism and materialism. You must choose. And you must choose the good side, as always, of course, which is known in advance. It's an absolute catastrophe. Excuse me, which is not to say that when Marx says, for example, I I'm adopting a materialist point of view on this. He has no reasons to do it. They're not always the same, but they can be very sound. But the dichotomy, the line of demarcation, is associated with a kind of metaphysical projection of the political problem of choosing side or adopting a partisan. I'm very much for the idea of partisanship. The greatest Marxists, in my opinion, are those who elaborate this idea of partisanship. But the idea of partisanship is, in my opinion, is linked to the idea that in a given situation, which can be an intellectual or philosophical situation, of course, you cannot not choose. So you have to choose. So you cannot be synthetic and eclectic. But it's totally separated from the idea that the terms of the choice have been eternally defined.
Okay, let me collect 3 questions, and then maybe that'll be, and then we'll, that'll be it. So I've got 1 question in the room, and I've got 2 on Zoom. We've got quite a few people still on Zoom with us. So why don't we start with the room, and then I'll try to read and one translate. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Feel free to introduce yourself. I'm sorry.
Yeah, my name is Robin. I'm a student from the European Graduate School, Philosophy and Critical Thought. I have a question. I try to be brief. Maybe this is something that could offer a pathway for actualization. I wanted to ask you if you could maybe say some more words about what seems to appear as a dialectics between the change or transformation of the self, Selbstveränderung, and of course of the world, die Weltveränderung. And so it seems also that that is, even on a linguistic level, very compellingly articulated in the 3rd thesis, where these 2 literally fall together, zusammenfallen, is what Marx says. But then, of course, we know that in the tradition, especially of Orthodox Marxism, maybe the 6th thesis was used very much to read over that, where the essence...
6?
Yes.
6.
Yes. Of course, not by everybody, but many would just go from the essence of the human being to the social relationships and kind of leave out the very complex dialectic that seems to be at work between the transformation or transformability of the self and the world. And nowadays, so it seems that it goes one way. You have to change the social relations, and then, of course, the self will be changed. Whereas nowadays, it seems to be the complete opposite. If at all any change in the social relations is imaginable, you have to start with yourself. That has become kind of the new orthodoxy. So there, again, it seems to evade this dialectics. So I wanted to ask if you could maybe elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think we should just take them one at a time, because that's a lot and really important, I think. But don't, wait. That's kind of key. I mean, in terms of actualizing, right? Yeah.
The category world excuse me, is not simple, is not innocent. What I'm tempted to say first, what I will say first, is that to change the world, to change it, sie zu verändern, meaning the world, clearly at the same time, or in the same move, in the course of the same writing, addresses to horizons and combines them. Given what has everything that has been said, the earthly family, the civil society, there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that when Marx talks about the world here, what he has in mind is a social world. So the social world is a world in which precisely that's in which the humans or individuals interact in institutional, practical, perhaps even ideological manner, and the continuation, the continuity, or the accumulation of these interactions is what we call history. I was trying to retrieve the place. I'm sure it is there, but I didn't find it immediately. Where the name history, it's if I well remember, it's there only once in the text. Six, and it's there in combination.
The penultimate paragraph.
Penultimate
to abstract from the historical process, at least. I mean, that's one place where it is, it seems.
There's no other. Six, yes.
That's the, I think that's the only place.
Anyway, we'll retrieve it. But so the world, he's talking about is the historical social world, and that is, or that ought to become very concrete. The more you know about how people work, how people rule over others, how people built states, churches, everything that Hegel was talking about in the philosophy of right, plus everything he was not talking about, and that Marx and Engels were discovering at the time. So that's it's it's of course not positivist, but it's positive. It's a positive meaning of it. And then there is another element that I don't think we can rule out, which is the I would not say the mystical, but the eschatological resonance and connotation of the idea of changing the world. Because change, and that can have, of course, I have the almost contemporary essay, text, introduction into the critique of the Hegelian philosophy of law in mind, where the proletariat, and I've tried to show, I was not the only one, but in a text years ago, that this was a messianic moment in Marx's writing, and that all his formulations were communicating with the, of course, a question that haunts every eschatology: absolute destruction leading to absolute or complete redemption. So to transform the world also means that we leave nothing in place. Everything has to be destroyed, or destroyed. If I was Agamben, of course I would say it has to be destituted, or for everything to be what? Redeemed, recreated, and you know that Marx also used these formulas. The leap from the world of necessity into the world of liberty, that all comes from Kant, comes from religion. So you have these two aspects. Now, how to connect them he uses the word rational in a manner that it is not mystical. Precisely by bringing in this question of the self or the transformation of self. And I want to, if I had time, I have already said it. I mean, return to the idea that the social world is a world inhabited, so to speak, and structured by a division, an internal division, an internal contradiction that is so radical and violent, if you want to, that its own development inevitably leads to the radical destruction that makes possible a total reconstruction. So whether we can still be Marxist in that sense, that's a good question. But the Marxists historically, one way or another, never forgot that. So as a consequence, the idea of transforming the world and the idea of self-transformation or transforming not the self in a psychological sense, but self as a kind of speculative entity are two faces of the same process. Now, how do we apply that? So a long time ago, I wrote, forgive me for, I wrote an essay, very professorial, I'm afraid, published originally in Les Temps Modernes and then republished, which was called Three Concepts of Politics. So I classified concepts. And in the middle, concept number 2 was transformation, or change. And at this point, I said, and I wrote, if we ask ourselves what kind of transformations are at stake in politics, we have two models. Of course, at the time, Foucault had just, I don't remember the year, but the publication of his last essays, and then the courses on governmentality and the aesthetics of the self. So where I simplified terribly in speaking before this is a radical destruction. A radical destruction. Okay, the good readers of Foucault are here and they will object to my simplifications, but the Stoic legacy is very strong there, even if it is modernized and rectified. So that led me to suggesting that you had two concepts of transformation or change. Either as a Marxist, a communist, you aim at transforming the world, which means changing capitalism into socialism, or as a post-Nietzschean, Foucauldian philosopher and thinker of politics, you place at the very center the issue and the objective of governing oneself and others, and therefore something like changing yourself, your life, your way of life, your sexuality, your relationship to others, your relationship to power, of course, in continuous interaction with others. So the two things seem to be divorced from one another. And I have come to that's you'd say vague, but to realize that this is a very bad, abstract, mechanical kind of dichotomy, as well for Marx as for Foucault, probably. But I'm not suggesting that we should, so to speak, reunite or fuse together the question of the revolution and the question of the subjectivation as if they were just two names for the same thing. Or you have to be Deleuzian, because that's it's. But so I think that this tension is crucial. Sometimes it's tragic, and Marx had glimpses of that. There's a phrase that I always found very interesting. This will come in the course of the seminar. The revolutions took place in 1948. We must try, and we have seen several revolutions, blah, blah, and each time the Russian counter-revolutionary are counted by hundreds, thousands, even more. But try and imagine the shock that this has been. Because when Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, it ends not exactly with a prophecy. Yes, it ends with the revolution is there tomorrow, not after tomorrow. Tomorrow, the revolution, because the contradictions of capitalism have reached the point where they are no longer sustainable. So many times, Marxists have explained that we have reached the point where the contradictions are no longer sustainable. He has a beautiful idea derived from his early reading of Ricardo. He says capitalism, well, we observe that today, but we don't draw the conclusion that capitalism is dead. Capitalism is no longer able to feed the very individuals or humans who work for it and feed its permanent accumulation. So this is the end, and the revolution will take place. And the revolution, and he was not the only one who wrote such things at the time. And so the revolution arrives, and what the revolution produces is first a massacre of the proletariats, and second a new, a fresh start for a capitalist development without precedent. In its scale. So at this point, Marx says to himself, "There's something I did not understand. There's something I did not understand in the logic of capitalism. So I must return to the critique of political economy and the books, the British Museum, etc., blah blah." And propose a more dialectical, in fact, or like a contradictory representation of the tendencies, the historicity of capitalism as a mode of production. Which, of course, interestingly leads him at some point to explaining that the end will arrive, but it will be postponed. And on the other hand, he writes somewhere in the letter, I can retrieve that, to I don't remember if it was to Engels or some another comrade. The proletariat will have, he doesn't write, I quote of memory, just to educate itself, which is what party leaders are never tired of explaining, educate yourselves. But to change itself in order to become able to carry the inner contradictions of capitalism to their political conclusion. So the element, it's it's not the complete problem of changing self, but it's an interesting indication of the fact that you can never in practice, in practice, reduce the question of the transformation of the world to a pure objective process, even and above all, if you add to that the eschatological imagination of the future.
Okay. I just wanted to add a footnote maybe to that, which is that one of the places where I find the contradiction and the confrontation most powerful in its expression is putting Foucault's reading of Nietzsche against Lukács's critique of Nietzsche. And it's almost as if Lukács, who is writing of Nietzsche, because it's writing in 54, because it's almost as if there's a direct conversation there over questions of self-transformation and subjectivity. And yeah, I mean, you might not be happy or object or something, but in Lukács's kind of anticipation of questions of self-transformation and critique of them, I actually think that's something we need to return to today. So
is that the destruction of reason?
Yeah. But the portions where he is anticipating kind of the way in which desubjectification, right? It's almost as if he's responding, simply can kind of, make you feel good about yourself. It was really a sharp critique of it, and actually deactivate, right? Lead you away from practice. So. Vas-y, prends ton micro là. Ok. Je crois qu'on va finir là sur.
Yes,
donc,
yes.
Donne-nous nos dernières.
Sorry.
I think this
We
has been a
stopped there.
marathon,
We
and
just stopped.
with apologies to.
No, we just stopped. Somebody
Alvé
wanted
Harlow,
to say something.
Raphael Kachurian,
Why
Mimi
prevented
Sila,
from
and other
saying
people on the Zoom. I think we're probably going to need to wrap it up. But vas-y.
Oh, it's just that Foucault once, I put that, and other friends commented on that, provocatively said, I don't remember who was the interlocutor, I am a Nietzschean communist,
Ah oui, bien sûr.
which seems to be a contradiction in terms, or a unity of opposites. But I take it to so Marx was not a Nietzschean communist. So that's he could not become a Nietzschean communist. So, and that, of course, one of the remarkable features of the thesis on Feuerbach, and that would take us back to your question, is the consistent way in which, in fact, Marx works against dichotomies or simple dichotomies. There's something, of course, that comes from Hegel there. The subject and the object are not to be separated and so on. So the passivity and the activity. But another crucial problem, politically and philosophically, is, of course, the antithesis of individuality and community. And what I find very intriguing and strange in the thesis is the fact that I said the categories that we expect are not there. One of them is communism, of course, and so there is this this interesting play on the social and the human. The objective, the goal, the final goal, if there is one, is a socialized humanity, which is the same as a humanized society. This is a nice play on on words, but so why not say a communist society? I mean, something like that. I believe because it is the very opposition of the individual and the collective or the common that he's trying to avoid. And of course, I'm plaidé pour mon sein because I propose trans individuality as another name for this social relation, something that crosses or traverses the individuals, but also that not bridges the gap, but subverts the ordinary antithesis between the isolated individual and the common or the social. Now, Nietzsche or Foucault are not individualists in that bourgeois sense, as I perceive them. They are, of course, hyper individualists. I mean, they are individualists in an aristocratic sense, which probably Marx would have rejected with despise and etc. But which we might perhaps really need to overcome the banalities and I would not say the horrors, but the bureaucratic assertion of the collective at the expense of the individual.
Well, I think that was the perfect place to stop, actually, because that's exactly where, or part of where we will be going next Tuesday at Marx 213 with Judith Revel, interrogating actually the place of Marx and Foucault and questions of individualism surrounding the questions of illégalisme and in the debate over the theft of wood. So I think that's a perfect way to end. Étienne, thank you so much for this way of.
Thank you for staying. I can't understand.
Yeah, it's been a marathon. Thank you. Thank you so much for, in a way, blowing open Marx for us and for the year.
Everything remains to be.
Thank you. And thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Ricardo in New York.
Anthony.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. See you next Tuesday.
Okay.
Thank you. Ça va être dans la salle de conférence. It'll be right here in at Columbia, in the salle de conférence.
Merci beaucoup. À bientôt. Nous veulent retrouver nos photos. Ouais. Il est parti sur la table. Ah oui, il est là. Il y a tous les jeux. Ah non, je rentre là, moi j'ai encore. Ah, very good to see you. Fourth. Huh? No. You know it better. Okay. Yes. Very nice. Very nice. You are